Captain Bowditch commanding, continuation, bottom of page 233. Nat waited. He waited through days and nights of heat that seemed to come from an oven. The decks of the Putnam oozed tar. Every day he went ashore to the village. All around him, the squat brown men of Sumatra spoke politely, and each carried a crease in the folds of his sarong. Their ruler, the Dado, was very polite. The captains, he said, were paying $10 for a pickle of pepper. Perhaps if the captain of the Putnam would pay 11. Nat said he'd wait. More days passed. The heat bore down. The fragrance of the frangipani, honeysuckle, and jasmine grew heavy enough to strangle a man. Nat longed for the tang of a sea breeze off the North Atlantic. The Dado was more polite. Pepper was coming in more and more slowly, he said. He feared the crop was running low. Perhaps if the captain of the Putnam could advance a small sum, say 1,000 or so silver dollars, then the Dado could urge his men to greater effort. Nat said he'd wait. The Dado sighed and fingered his crease. That night, Nat could not sleep. He went topside to pace the deck. Somewhere he heard a snore. He went forward. Corey, who was on watch, was sleeping. Nat spoke quietly. "Corey! Corey!" His voice brought old Chad running up the hatchway. "What's wrong, Captain? Is he hurt?" Chad's voice cracked. "Is he dead?" Corey started and mumbled. "What? Aye, aye, sir." Chad roared. "You! Asleep on your watch?" The tongue lashing he gave his grandson brought the whole crew topside. "What was it?" they asked. "Had the Malays tried to board?" "If they had," Nat roared, "you'd all be dead in your sleep." He turned on his heel and went aft. There was nothing he needed to say to Corey. There was nothing he could say to the heartbroken old man who was Corey's grandfather. More days crawled by. At last the Dado said he would have pepper for the Putnam tomorrow. The next morning Nat gave Mr. Denny orders. He was to begin unloading ballast so he could store pepper. He was not under any condition to let more than 2 Malays on board ship at one time. Nat took Lupe ashore with him. The boat crew landed the scales in a money chest and carried them to the square. The boat returned to the Putnam. Lupe and Nat were alone in a swarm of bandy-legged, barrel-chested, powerful brown men. More and more men swarmed into the square with their baskets of pepper to be weighed and stored in bags. Finally, the pepper bags made a wall shoulder high. If the captain would pay now, the Dado said, the men would begin taking the pepper to the ship. The price was $12 per pickle. Nat did not hesitate. He slammed down the lid on the money chest. "Mr. Sanchez, call a boat for us. We'll get pepper somewhere else." Lupe's smile stretched. His eyes were flat black and watchful. He prowled from the square and left Nat alone in the swarm of Malays. 2 minutes passed. 3 and 5. More brown men thronged into the square. A violent argument arose. Nat wished he had had a grammar and dictionary of their language too. It might have helped to know what they were saying. At last the Dado approached him, smiling, his hand on his crease. It had been very hard work, he said, but he had persuaded the men to give up their pepper at $11 a pickle. The men were sad. It was choice pepper, the best of the season. That much was true, Nat knew. When the pepper began ripening in January, it ripened on the lower branches first. Not until May were the men harvesting the best of the crop. $11 a pickle? Nat opened the money chest again. When Lupe returned, the Malays were shouldering the pepper bags and hurrying to the water's edge, loading their prows. Lupe smiled again, and this time the grin reached his eyes. "Senor," he drawled, "you are quite a guy." Nat and Lupe went to the beach and watched the boat speed toward the Putnam. 10 boats, more than 50 men. As they watched, a ladder dangled from the Putnam. Instantly, a dozen Malays were laying hold, ready to climb. They could hear the angry shouts. Then they saw Denny, Watson, and Jensen appear at the rail with muskets. The Malays edged back. 2 went on board. Nat and Lupe returned to the square to buy more pepper. The next day, the Dado was sad. Why couldn't his men help on the Putnam? They could save the white men much work at stowing the cargo. Lupe explained. With his mirthless smile and his watching eyes, he explained. Their captain, he said, was a harsh man. He liked to work his crew hard. Also, he murmured to Nat, we do our own work. We live longer, eh? June passed, and half of July. More ships anchored at Tully Pass. One morning, when Nat went ashore, the Dado spread his hands and sighed. The 200 pickles he had promised for today, it would be impossible to get. I wonder, Lupe muttered, how much who is paying for pepper? Now what? Do we wait him out again? Nat smiled. No, we don't wait him out. We sail. We'll complete our cargo with coffee at the Isle of Bourbon or the Isle of France. He told Lupe of the 2 French islands east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. I made my first sea voyage to Bourbon, he said. How long ago it seemed. When they reached the Isle of France, 3 ships of Salem and Beverly were there. Polly's father, Captain Ingersoll, was just ready to weigh anchor. He came aboard the Putnam to see Nat and get news to take home to Polly. How was it in Sumatra? Any trouble? Oh, no, Nat told him. Quite uneventful. Lupe's grin spread. Captain Bowditch, he is one guy. Captain Ingersoll cocked his head to one side. So nothing happened, eh? I see. Well, I'll tell Polly all is well and to look for you soon after I arrive. It shouldn't take you more than a week to load coffee here. They cheered Captain Ingersoll on his way. Nat said, Mr. Denny, call the men aft. Soon his men stood facing their captain, a tired crew, haggard with the long months of heat and the grinding toil of the passage to the Isle of France. He knew that every man standing there wanted at least a week on shore before they sailed. He said, Captain Ingersoll tells me there's plenty of coffee to complete our cargo. Then, when we've wooded, watered, and provisioned, we'll weigh anchor, and we won't wet that anchor again till Salem Harbor. Do we bear a hand? They split the air with cheers. In 5 days, the Putnam stood out from the island. When Nat had taken his departure, he did some figuring. It had taken the Henry 11 weeks from Bourbon to Salem. The Putnam was faster. With luck, they'd be home in early November, maybe even the last of October. They ran into a storm that night. For days, they lived in wet clothes and ate cold food. The Putnam was rolling much too heavily for the cook to make fire in the galley. They doubled the cape and fought headwinds. No speed from the Putnam now. She seemed to crawl. With a fair wind abaft the beam, the ship could have logged 150 miles in a day's sailing. Now she fought headwinds from tack to tack, and some days sailing did not take her 15 miles nearer home. When the storms are over, Lupe said, we make up for it, eh? But the storms were never over. For several days at a time, Nat was not able to take a sight. October passed. November came. With luck, Nat told himself now, they'd be home by early December. With good luck, he added. In December, they reached the roaring 40s of the North Atlantic and groped their way, close-hauled in the teeth of the gales. At last the storm subsided. At 6 bells of a forenoon watch, Nat said, Mr. Denny, heave to for soundings. Watson carried the deep-sea lead forward, and the other men followed, each with fakes of the line coiled in his hand. Collins on the cathead, Sandy in the forechains, and Jensen in the main chains. Mr. Denny was on the quarterdeck, with the rest of the line coiled. Denny sang out, All ready there forward? Watson bellowed, Aye, aye, sir. Heave! Watch ho, watch! It was Collins on the cathead. Watch ho, watch! From Sandy in the forechains. Watch ho, watch! It was Jensen in the main chains. Mr. Denny sang out, 60 fathoms! They hauled in the lead. Nat checked it. Black mud! They were off Block Island. Block Island, Lupe grinned. Next door to home, and then the storm is dying. But the storm raged again, as though it had been gathering its strength for one more assault on the Putnam. Long days passed. The 15th of December, when they sounded, the lead brought up sand. "Off Nantucket," Lupe said. "I dress in my go-ashore clothes." Then the stormy North Atlantic proved that all the other gales had been mere child's play. For 7 days and nights the Putnam was deluged and hammered. At last the skies cleared. Nat made his observations. "I could have swum from Nantucket that fast," he muttered. Clouds darkened the sky again. For 3 days the rain poured in the waterfall torrents of tropical storms. Only this rain was cold and mixed with sleet, and men struggled with numb fingers to reef and loose sails. In his cabin, Nat rested his head on his hands. He had hoped to be home in early November, with luck the end of October. Christmas Eve, and they weren't home yet. Something clawed at his attention. He looked around puzzled, then realized what it was. The wild rolling and pitching of the Putnam had lessened. At 8 bells, Mr. Denny came to his cabin. "The rain's letting up?" Nat asked. "Aye, aye, sir." Mr. Denny was grim. "This is worse." "Worse?" "Yes, sir. Fog." He shook his head slowly from side to side. "I've seen fog in my day, but this one..." He shrugged, and his shrug was a shiver. "Fog."